Trees and tree guns.
No, can you all hear me? Well, unfortunately I have a cold, so I'm not going to be projecting that well. Right, first, welcome you all here today. Delighted to see the numbers here. We're very grateful and thankful as a committee that so many of you have turned up. The purpose of today's walk is to raise a little funds for the historical group. Through Mary's work in Lawrence and the group in general, we've managed to secure funding to buy Valencia stone plaques to plaque the village, the sites and the important people and important places in the village. Right, we've got generous funding from South Kerry Partnership, but we need to raise about €2,000 over the next year to fund the rest of it. So hence the bit of walking, a bit of talking for the next few months. We hope, we're assured by the council that the road improvement through the village is to begin in the second quarter. So the council will do the work for us. There'll be new pavement, new roads in the village. So the slabs which are ordered will be laid in the pavements. So there are a series of 15 or 16 slabs ordered. So that's the purpose of today's walk. Right, so we have a beautiful village and I'm delighted to be able to applaud it and promote it, the beauty of the people here. But this is a great place to start, because the first settlements in Annascaul, most of the settlement in Annascaul was up towards the lake, the Ballinacurty side, or over east towards the Ballinvour side. The village 250 years ago was effectively not here. Whatever settlements were down at this end of the village. But the first significant thing that happened during settlement to Annascaul is this road was built, and that road up the mall. And the purpose of the road, these roads were built in the 1760s, and they were British military roads, and they were built to link the garrison towns of Dingle and Killarney. So they shortened the distance of the march by 9 miles. Right, previously the road to Dingle, or the road through here, there was no road by the coast. So the road would go about 3 miles east of the village, up towards the hill, back Ballinacurty and out that way. So the middle here was not there. So that was the first significant thing. So 1760s, the British military road was straight road up the moor and up the height here. Right? The second important part of the development of the place is the main road through the village came in 1831, and that was a mail road. It was built by the British Mail, and so settlement, the first settlement had happened down here in the 1760s onward because of down the back road and up this way. But the middle of the village started coming from the 1830s, 1840s onward, because they had a new road. Wait, this bridge was not part of the original 1760 military road. There was no bridge here. This was still crossed by, the river was still crossed by a ford, by stones. Wait, the 1830s road saw this bridge being constructed. Right, so this was the first bridge basically in West Kerry linking Dingle to the road, to the Killarney road and to the Tralee road. The older road around here, the river walk brings you out at a place we call Shandrohid. And that bridge has been there. That bridge predates all of them. So, but this route comes from the 1760 building of the road and the 1830s mail road. Right, the other significant thing that we can no longer see, but that belongs to here, is that building above there is the village presbytery. But those grounds were the railway station for the Tralee Dingle line. So that's there was railway here until the railway ran between the 1890s to 1953. The last passenger service through was 1938, but it ran for 14 years afterward on a freight basis of taking fish and cattle from Dingle. Right, the death knell of it probably as a passenger service was the bus had been established in Dingle, and the CAE bus would beat the train to Tralee. So people had lost faith in the train as a passenger. Remember, it was a steam train. It was a hilly terrain, so it didn't have the power. And we were after coming out of the 1930s and 40s, the late 30s. We had the economic war in Ireland, so coal was not available to power the railway. So you were dependent on wet turf for steam for your train. So the train was no longer becoming a viable option in West Kerry. But the railway station proper was in that field, and there's still some remnants. Those you're familiar with the village know that the water tower is still up, and the railway cottage is converted to a residence and a home now. But right beside us before we leave, obviously Tom Crean, the South Pole. Tom Crean, as most of you know, an Arctic explorer. He and his wife bought that building, didn't? And it had been a pub before them, and it was ran as a pub. His wife was the publican. His wife came from Foley's pub in the middle of the village. She was Nell Hurley. So 4 of the village pubs were Hurley pubs. And there were 10 pubs in the village in the early 20th century. And where the new building is beside the South Pole, that was one of 2 village smiths. The forge was there. And that forge was run by the Coonahan family. And the forge was important in any small agricultural village, because it was a forge that the horse was shoed, the cart wheels were banded, and whatever implements and whatever work had to be done by the agricultural community, people came from Glenmenard, from as far over as Mom, from Inch to the forge. So there were 2 in the village. All right, so we'll head up through the village. This walk, I hope, is about an hour. Right, John's granduncle, you can see the gate of his house, was named Paddy Kennedy. Paddy Kennedy lost his life in a reprisal for the Balclar ambush of a black and tan truck on August 2020. As part, John over the years has been very anxious to commemorate his granduncle, so
not his granduncle, commemorate Balclar ambush.
And the ambush. That's why he should be talking. He's shy, but he'll correct me. Yeah. So he's kindly donated the site Hannah is standing on for a memorial for an ambush monument. So the proposed, the work and the planning and everything is secured.
Except for the money.
Most of the money is secured, except for the money, he said. And hopefully, work commences next few weeks. That it's going to be there by August the 20th this year. So on the 102nd anniversary. Yeah.
Subject to money.
So, all right, stop the money. Yeah. But this is a significant area of the village. This area of the village was called Strand Road. Right, now we know it as Ardrinan. But this part of the village, where we are now, the village courthouse was here. And the village courthouse had a couple of significant events. Later on, we'll be stopping at Walsh's house. The Walshes here were the IRA volunteer commanders, but they put up an anti-conscription poster. The conscription come to Ireland after during the First War, and the Walshes, as all the volunteers, opposed conscription. So they had an anti-conscription poster in the window because furore in the village, and the Walshes were arrested for displaying the poster, and their mother was thrown on the floor and everything. But the Walshes were tried in this courthouse, and they were sentenced to time in jail in Cork. But as a result of that, the Garda sergeant that was in Annascaul during this period was the Sergeant Maloney. He was a Tipperary man, and Maloney was hated after that for his brutality in old Mrs. Walsh and the fact that he intervened. But Maloney had, as part of his duties, he had escorted the Walshes to Cork, to the jail, and on his way back, he came back by the railway, and the barracks was up in the middle of the village where Mary's house is. So he's walking up the village and he's shot at from here. So I'd like to think this was the first shot of the Irish War of Independence, not in Solahead Bay. So Maloney had a big, heavy overcoat on. So the shot was of a shotgun. So the pellets dispersed and it didn't really penetrate the overcoat. So he wasn't fatally wounded, but he got sufficient fright that he applied for a transfer and was transferred out of here shortly afterward. But the other significant stint, when Paddy Kennedy was murdered in the foot of Gertines Hill, the inquest into his death was held in the courthouse. So that courthouse, I don't know, went out of use, I suppose, in the 30s, but it became, it had life at, next door to us then, there was a double row of houses that the O'Briens, they were originally owned by Lades, but Tom Crean's daughters married into those houses, and those houses were demolished and they went to Tralee, so the Crean family left the village. Anything else on this side? You've upset my flow now. I was going from the church until I see you up here. Come on, then, add to the narrative.
I wait.
Come on.
We're going to have the set of wheels here eventually. The wheels off the cross the timber.
Yeah. The only part of when the ambush happened, the part of the truck that was preserved that lasted 100 years was the axle and the two wheels of the truck. For years it was behind in Gortacran in the front garden of John Kennedy's field. But the wheels we have in our possession. So the monument is Valentia slate pack with the details, but the piece de resistance of the display will be the wheels. And the wheels are going to be left in the state they exist in now. There's bits of rubber, bits of rust, bits of everything in them. But they've survived 100 years, so they'll probably outlast us. So behind us in the Aircom yard stood the parish church, the Church of Ireland Church for the village. So that was demolished, unfortunately, in the 60s. One of the great travesties of the village that went. But the church was, like any of you familiar with the area, most of the Church of Ireland churches here are quite small, rectangular buildings. So the Church of Ireland here was along similar lines to the one in Milltown, the St. James's Church in Dingle. So I was just looking at some records this morning, In the 1856, it was the first rateable valuation of this area, but they recorded 370 families living here in the 1850s. In 1856 valuation, there were 17 Church of Ireland families. Right, so this was the Church of Ireland church. Right, the other significance of the Church of Ireland church, beside it, it had a schoolhouse right behind the that railing. So there was, and in the 1911 census, there's 4 pupils recorded in the Church of Ireland schoolhouse. Right, the church grounds had a cemetery. So there is Lawrence here. There is, I think Lawrence got recorded, or just, there's about 60 graves, I think, in the area, or in the cemetery. Right, a lot of them. The Church of Ireland community here, wouldn't be big enough like for the 60 graves, but they had a habit of seamen lost at sea, particularly merchant seamen. The Dingle was a port at the time, and if people died on board ship or lost at sea, their remains were, some of them were buried here. So there were strange names that have no bearing with here, but there were seamen that were lost in Dingle. The church in Dingle, those who are familiar with it, again, the cemetery was around the church, but because it was much smaller and it was in the town, they didn't want to use the valuable space of the church grounds in Dingle to be burying people that were of no connection to the town. So those were buried here.
Will we go into the graveyard now, will we?
All right, we'll look over there. The other, that church was built in the 1820s. Right, further on, a little further on, in the 1840s, there was, or 1850s, there was a trend towards evangelicalism in the Protestant community, and it was a more robust form of Protestantism, and it was funded mostly by merchants from Limerick and Cork, and West Kerry was funded by a Limerick group of merchants. And the reason they funded it is that there would be a tithe, a charge levied on the community, the Church of Ireland community, so they would get their investment back. So the Church of Ireland churches, particularly west of Dingle, were built by the Board of First Fruits. Right, but the bishops, the Church of Ireland bishop, the diocese was Limerick and Firth. He did not want evangelical Protestantism to spread through the county, so he stopped it in Annascaul. And where he managed that, it was right up the Strand Road. There is it's owned by Zach, and Zach's mum, nowadays Zach Feile house up there, was built by the Protestant Bishop of Limerick, and he sent a clerical diocese man here whose sole purpose was to stop the evangelical movement going any further east. So evangelicalism didn't get hold of Annascaul, and it didn't go further east here. So he was quite successful. Right, the Church of Ireland rector, he lived in another big house further up the road, in Bill Brosnan's land, and he was the parson Sweeney. So even though the community was small here, there were only 17 families, it had a substantial presence in the village. There had a church, a school, and probably the two finest houses in the village were by the church community. Right. On the other hand, there was no Catholic church in the village. There was no parish of Annascaul as we know nowadays. That didn't come till the 1840s. So the Catholic churches, there was one in Ballinacurty in the graveyard and one over in Ballinvour. So there was no civil parish of Annascaul. There were broken up parishes of Ballinvour, Ballinacurty, Menard, times were part of Camp Parish, part of Loch Parish. So Church of Ireland was far more organised and unified than its Catholic counterpart. Robert, you probably know a lot more than Robert's grandfather. Your grandfather is.
My grandfather's buried here.
Yeah.
Some of his predecessors as well.
And at the time, like there was big, I won't say rivalry, but like when Robert's grandfather was buried, what years?
1954.
Yeah, like it was frowned upon that, or it wouldn't be permitted, like that. Would say his Catholic neighbours could attend his funeral service, but some of them said to hell with the restriction or the ideas. So some did. Yeah, there's a famous poem. Some of you that are familiar might be familiar with Irish history or Irish poetry. The burial of an Irish president. Douglas Hyde's been buried, and all the dignitaries of the time are scurried, hiding behind headstones outside the door of the Protestant cathedral, because they're afraid to go in, because those were the times of that. Well, in more recent times, we have a Church of Ireland community in Camp now, and there's a meeting or events are held by both communities, by both groupings. So we'll proceed. If anybody's anything to add or I've stopped here because these houses, like as I was telling you, a lot of this part of the village didn't start until the 1840s. This part beyond. So this is kind of the last part of the old village, the original village. But across the road from us, behind Sean Evans's house, there was the first village hotel was there, and that's had an interesting history. The lake up in top Connor Pass is called the Peddler's Lake. It's called the Peddler's Lake because there was a tinsmith, a peddler, murdered, and his body was disposed of in the lake. Well, the peddler was engaged to a lady from it, and they had sawn or cut a sovereign coin in half. The peddler's coin was found in possession of the two suspected of his murder, and it matched the other half of the coin held by the Feile lady. So the two were arrested, but the jail, they were being escorted to the jail in Tralee. The journey was too long, so they were billeted overnight across the road in the hotel or the guest house. But they made their escape during the night through a hole they cut a hole in the thatch. They got out through the roof of the building and they were never seen again. So they would have escaped certain execution. So they left. I should know who had the guest house. It was beyond. I keep calling it Corbin, but it wasn't Corbin. Yeah. But and the other thing is, so most of you will have heard the scale for wind measurement is a scale called the Beaufort scale. Daniel Beaufort. But Daniel Beaufort's father was a guy called John Beaufort. John Beaufort wrote travel books in the 1780s, and amongst his travelling he travelled to England from Killarney, and he stopped overnight in Annascaul, but he didn't like the accommodation offered in his hotel, and it's recorded as being squalid. So he didn't stay in Annascaul, as far as I can see from. So, by these buildings, John Brosnan's pub, Tuck Sean, what we used to call Sean Evans's house, their buildings are built by British Navy pensions. In Annascaul, 100 odd years ago, it was a farming community, and the first son might have got the farm, but the subsequent son, a lot of them would have gone as RIC officers, and here there was a tradition of joining the British Navy, because the Navy, the Coast Guard had a presence in Menard Castle, and you couldn't formally enlist, but you could make an initial enlistment in the Coast Guard station, and they would give you the fare on the train from Annascaul to Cove, where you formally joined the British Navy. So in the period that Tom Crean, if you look at the records, 5 years either side of Tom Crean, there are 16 people from this area enlisted in the British Navy. Well, it came, like, they served their time in the British Navy, and when it came to retirement, they came back with pensions. So they had the means and the money to build some of the more modern or better houses in the village. So the cut stone houses, most of them follow a similar pattern. The other significance here is the Annascaul Village had two landlords would be the wrong word, but it had two landowners or rights owners that the rates money was paid to, that there was a stipend paid to. And the bottom end of the village was a lady or a family called the Pearsons, and the Pearses lived across the road here. And Maggie Pearse and her family got the monies or the rates from the householders at the bottom end of the village. And when we moved towards the top, what's now the Leprechaun pub was Moriarty's Hotel associated with Hickson. So they were the rate owners in the top part of the village. So behind us was one of the pubs. There was one of 10 village pubs. So this was, and most of the pubs were, they've all a life of over 130, 140 years old. The pub that we began, the pub that I have myself, I can trace it back to roughly the time just beyond the Mail Road, from about the 1840s. I'm the fourth generation of my family in it, and there were 2 generations of Carolines before. So there were 6 generations in that pub. So it'd be like, and most of these houses in the village. Jimmy O'Donnell's shop was bought by his father. It was Cabinet's shop beforehand, and it was one of 9 general shops in the village. So, like, most of the houses on the village have a story to tell or a life. They provided a service or a trade or something to the general area. So that's why over the next while I'm anxious that that history is kept and that it's plaqued and preserved for the future. Because Annascaul is like, it's the same as all villages of its time in Ireland. There's a story to tell, there's a part to tell those stories and record it. Okay. Let's see, 2016. That was the time of the ambush time that we commemorate. Yeah.
When you were talking about the box of traffic going through it, nobody can hear the video traffic. Stop talking about the traffic going through it.
How do you style support so many times?
Because it served the community, it served the hinterland of maybe about 1,200 people. It was difficult. This village existed for the agricultural community more than. Right. So this gentleman has asked a very perceptive question. He's asked me how did a village of this size support 10 pubs and 10 shops, which is quite right. The village, like Annascaul Village, served the community from Menard to the top of the Mom to Camp. So, while the village itself probably might have 100 families living in it, the greater community of 500 or 600 families. But the village, I know from the pub point of view. My mother was born in the 30s and raised in the pub, and she would tell me that growing up, was difficult from financial and every point of view. But the village depended on, it had 12 fairs. It had a fair day on the 14th of each month, and it had 2 big fairs, the Bealtaine fairs, which were in October and May. So the pubs, in particular, from the pub point of view, the pub would have to make enough money on the Bealtaine fair day to last till the next one, or the fair day, 14th of the month. So she said, she would have told me, the only, the farming, money was scarce at the time. In Ireland in the 30s, 40s, nobody had money. And most people were self-sufficient. They didn't need money. And there was a lot of helping your neighbour, and there wasn't the exchange of money. But the farmers, they would come to the fair and spend what they had, sell the cow, and the woman of the house obviously got most of the money, but he had an allocation. But the only people that had a regular kind of income were the retired, as I was saying below, were the retired Navy officers, the retired RIC men, the people that had a pension, a regular pension, were the everyday lifeblood of the publican trade in the village anyhow. But this is a small village. This village had 3 or 4 tailors, 3 or 4 dressmakers, a couple of cobblers. It even had a lady, the back of Dan Foley's pub where Marie Kennedy's house is. Marie Kennedy's called her house Mary Lane, but Mary Lane made habits for the dead. So it was, it sustained itself. And all popping up now but keep popping up with the bakery. The village had a bakery down below where Mick Devine's house is, where we stopped at the Protestant church. Just below the Protestant church was Dinisheen Brosnan, or Dinisheen the baker. And Dinisheen the baker had a thriving bakery business. He even had vans on the road supplying bread to outlying villages. Those of you of Lisbon, or those of you know Hugh the man. Hugh the man began his working life as a bread man for Dinisheen the baker. But Dinisheen the baker, as an aside, was a character in the village. I've grown up hearing about Dinisheen the baker because apparently Dinisheen the baker died the day I was born. So, and Dinisheen the baker was a good. He kept the pubs going. He probably kept the pubs going nearly in his own. Dinisheen the baker liked whiskey, but Dinisheen the baker, his teeth, because he liked the whiskey, his teeth had all rotted, and we had a dentist even in the village, and his dentist, or his rooms at the time, were the back of the Moriarty's Hotel, and he had up in the old walls and down the back, there were sets of dentures, and every time Dinisheen the baker required a set of dentures, he went up, put his hand up, and the worst part of the story, apparently Dinisheen the baker and his mother shared the set of dentures. And Dinisheen liked to drink, so the set of dentures was disappearing regular. So these little houses, the houses behind us, where he's saying, obviously people lived in them, but people had to survive. So this house that Patricia has now, I was telling her last night, this house was Sheehan's, or Shoehan's. And they were, I don't really know their background, but they had some type of an education beyond the ordinary, or beyond the other people. They must, they got a secondary schooling. But like people here finished primary schooling was as far as it went. And if you wanted to go any further, you had to do a thing called the primary cert. And if you wanted to become a clergyman or something, you had to have a little Latin. So the Sheehans provided the grind services for the village. So they existed. There was a son, or two sons and a father. And they were reclusive people, but they provided the little bit of extra learning for those going on from the village. So that's how they made their livelihood. Across the road was O'Donnell's Hotel. It was one of the village hotels. Dan Foley's pub was there. That was one of the Hurley pubs. Below the pub was a shop. Scannell's shop, but it was
Maggie Scannell.
Yeah, Maggie Scannell after, but 100 odd years ago it was a general merchant, and it was Moriarty's, I think, wasn't it? And it sold meal and flour. That house where John Brosnan's house was Scully's, but he provided a taxi service, but they had a garage at the bottom end of the village. The one below was a pub. So the one above Hannifan's Bar, my pub, was a tailor, was Lynch's. Mary's house above was the RIC barracks at the time, but that later became Lander's Garage. So every house in this village had some type of the cinema, yeah. So a cinema on Sunday night or Friday night or 2 nights. Yeah. And Mary Courtney shop for the sweets. So the yard we're standing in now was the RIC barracks. Right, the remains of what remains of the original barracks, the fireplace is that. Right, when the Iria Mock and the War of Independence happened, Michael Collins from Dublin issued a decree that all barracks, RIC barracks, or the presence of RIC barracks, be destroyed. So the barracks here was burnt in the 1920. It had been vacated because the RIC at the time were under threat, so they had concentrated all the barracks activity in West Kerry, in Dingle. So the other barracks, the barracks in Camp, the barracks in Castlereagh, and all that they were all burnt out in the 20s, during the year 1920. Mary has told me her own house was built in 1937, so by John Connor. And John Connor built a lot of the houses in the village, and it's similar. Same of a similar style. He didn't deviate. He didn't need any architect plans. He knew. They're all. So and this part then became right. Well, it was no longer the RIC barracks, but it became Lander's Garage, and it became the cinema. How many of you remember the cinema? Mike has asked were the talkies or and it was Connor's. And across the road was Connie Courtney's shop and the tea room. So Connie Courtney's shop supplied the sweets for the cinema. Yeah. So, and the cinema was on a, you can't remember, was it Friday or Sunday?
Friday.
That was long after 20
Have you anything to, what was your premises, how you were ever going to Give us a history, Brendan.
I couldn't hear with these two talking here, John. No, Connie Courtney's, yeah, it was a sweet shop. When I grew up here in the village as well, and he died in 1979. Mary lived on, and the shop was open until 1993. And every kid in the school got penny sweets there, ice cream, everything there, non-stop.
And growing up here in the middle of the village, on a Tuesday and Thursday, Liam Shannon came with cameo cakes. There was 2 trays of buns bought, but they were gone before the. But the buildings across the road is Brendan's, Balvy's Bar, and next door to what we Murphy's. All originated part of life from a character called he was Bowler, and he owned the shop or the building next door to Aiden's Cafe, and it was a pub. But Bowler, in the very early 1900s, Bowler carried a horse to Dingle Fair, and he sold the horse in Dingle Fair, but he didn't get paid for his horse. It was, and he went into a rage over it, and it was people from Tralee bought the horse, and he intercepted him here in the village, and he hadn't got his money for a horse, but he had a big knob of a stick, and he knocked the man off the horse and beat him within an inch of his life. He didn't die, but the RIC were here at the time, and because Bowler was known to them, they told Bowler, if your man dies, you will be. So they advised him to leave. So Bowler left his business in the village and went to America, and left. He had where the size of your pub and Murphy's and that was part of Bowler's estate, and the Pierces came and built the you have a photograph inside of the old Pierce up in the bar, have you?
Well, yeah, they built it. They thought the railway was going to run there as well.
Yeah, they built the 3 buildings across the road because the railway was the Pierces came from America, and he had made money. He had made money out of railways in America, so he knew the importance of providing facility for the railway. And the railway was coming to Annascaul, or through Annascaul at the time. So the railway station was to be around the middle end of the village. And he identified this area as a place to build his hotel or his guest house and his accommodation for the railway. So he built the building, and his daughter, I think that there's a photograph of her up inside in the bar, was put in charge, and he went back to America. But the railway was at the bottom end of the village, opposite the bridge. So, and he was, the traveller that was likely to come wasn't walking up here. He was staying below or staying above in Moriarty's hotel. So it didn't work quite as well as he had hoped. But a general, your house was Queen's before Callahan's came into it. But the next door was, both buildings were owned by a Dingle man called Daniel O'Connell. And Daniel O'Connell was a horse trader, and he traded in horses. The currency of the First World War was horses, and because they were needed for soldiers. And he bought horses, but he paid dear for them. And after the war, the market for horses collapsed, and he went basically bankrupt.
This is Mickey's grandfather.
Yeah, and he needed a bailout. So he had married an old lady from camp, a lady from camp, Mrs. Ellen Minor, not an old lady. But he decided he needed cash, so he made the wise move. He bought his sister-in-law, who was in her 40s, back to the village, and he divided the house in 2. And she was in the second part of the house. And he assumed, O'Connell, I assumed he assumed Niall, she was not going to marry. She was a spinster when she came to the village, and she was in her 40s. And the house was going to revert back to him again when she passed on. But unfortunately, there was a cobbler next door, Edmund Crean, and she met and married Crean. She had 2 children. So it thwarted O'Connell's plans to consolidate. But that's another. Yeah, and like Crean was one of several cobblers in the village. And there was, you remember Paddy Houlihan? Crean, the cobbler, his apprentices, like he was an altruistic man and maybe a clever man as well. But he adopted, he would bring kids or youths from orphanages. So that's how Paddy Houlihan arrived at the village. He was Edmund Crean's apprentice, but Paddy Houlihan later, he was, those of you that might, he was one of the original volunteers, 1916 brigade in the village, and he was the village postman, but he was a character. Yeah. So we'll stop outside the community centre. The community centre was interesting from the point of view, there was a butter buying family, a well-known business family from Cork called the Hollands. And the Hollands, for a period, owned the building behind us, and it was used for butter, for barreling and selling butter. So my great grandfather was a cooper by trade. There were two coopers in the village, and my great grandfather would have come from West Menard, which is about 5 or 6 miles distant, but he needed to be near the Hollands because he provided the barrels for the butter. So he bought a pub by a foreclosure auction. They ran into rent arrears, the people, the Hurley family that owned the pub, and the pub was auctioned off, and they got a part of the proceeds to feck off to Van Diemen's Land to Australia. But that's how John Kinderland originated. My great grandfather came to the village as a barrel maker, and he wasn't interested in the pub. At the back of the pub at that time, he built a workshop making barrels, and he made his wife the licensee in the pub because women were exempt from paying rates. So,
the brains.
yeah. So, and he provided the barrels for Mrs. Holland's butter making business here. Butter from Annascaul and from West Kerry was sent to the British Army, and most of the butter from West Kerry ended up in South Africa. It took 6 weeks from the butter from Annascaul to reach South Africa. It took 6 days by horse from the butter from Annascaul to reach the port in Cork, and 5 weeks from the port in Cork to go to South Africa. So the butter needed to be heavily salted. And the barrel he made are not like the familiar barrels that you see nowadays, the 40-gallon barrels that the spirits are stored in. The barrel was a 5-gallon barrel. So it was a small, compact barrel that it weighed roughly about 15 kilos. So about 30 pounds weight, 35 pounds weight. And those barrels went. Right, so the building just below where was one of 2 joiners or workshops in the village. It was Sullivan's, and the Egan's married into the Dinny Dans, and then the one here beside us was the second one. This was the Welch's house, and they used to say that the Welch's were the better craftspeople, they were the better carpenters, but the Dinny Dans had the better timber, because the Welch's hadn't the money or the quality of the timber is very dependent on its age. So the Welch's wouldn't wait for the timber to age. whereas the Dinidans were clever and wood. And the Dinidans, I think, I don't know, was it a brother-in-law or whatever, was involved in McCown's timber yard in Tralee. So the better parts of timber were put aside from them. But, you know, we were talking before about the wheels, the carts. The wheels were timber, obviously, the band wheels that were on the carts. So the Walshers would make the better wheel, but the wheel from the Dinidans would last longer. Well, and here, just above beside us, you see there's a banding. Right, there is where the wheel was laid, and the metal band by the blacksmith was put on the wheel. So you can see the sidewalk above here. We just stopped in front of Walsh's workshop. Yeah. So remember below when I was talking about the first shot of the War of Independence and Sergeant Maloney, this was the house that the Walshers lived in. They were Patrick Walsh was the captain of the volunteer regiment in Annascaul, and his brother was also involved. They were very Republican in orientation. So on these windows was the anti-conscription notice that caused the uproar in the furrow, and that the RIC barracks had a sergeant and usually 4 policemen. So on a small community there was 20 policemen, so they hadn't a whole lot to do, but they made their presence under order felt. So Sergeant Maloney apparently barged in the door to take down the conscription, and Mrs. Walsh opposed him inside the door, and he threw her on the floor. And her sons were subsequently arrested. Like one of them, Patrick Walsh, I think, spent 4 months in Cork jail in account of it, and existed on a diet of blighted, rotten potatoes while he was there. So you can imagine like the feeling towards Maloney and the likes. You can imagine why he was shot. Right next door here, just up here, was their workshop. So this was Walsh's workshop. And it wasn't quite as good when the IRA were in the 1916s when they were. But this was their meeting point. This was the drill hall, and you know, when they began. You know, in 1914, I think the volunteer column was established here. They were kind of laughed at as Thai soldiers in the village. And, you know, in subsequent events, 1916, the execution of the leaders, and the fact like that they'd spent time in jail and all that, changed people's opinion. So over a period of time, instead of being seen as Amadons wasting their time at a useless cause, it became an important part of the village. The original, I think Michael, he still have that board, the creamery, yeah. So before the creamery board was established in Ireland, you know, the people around here were farmers. So the mill was, you know, was it a company from Tralee, Robert, or who was it bought the original? There's a platform here to collect milk, and a truck came to collect the milk. So the milk was separated, like it was the cream they were. Yeah, like the buttermaker had gone at this stage with 100 or with 30 or 40 years. She didn't exist that whole long there, and the thing, you know, the war. My great grandfather's business was affected by the First War because timber was gone. Metal came during the 1914-18 war, so you had metal barrels. So my grandfather, Johnny the Cooper, is down in the 1911 census as an apprentice cooper. But and his brother Tyle is apprentice cooper as well, as 20. But by the 1921 census, he's a publican and Tige is a postman. And he messed, my mother would say that he messed around a little at there was still Cooper implements out the back of the pub when she was a young one, and he was able to make a barrel but she rarely, you know, there was no demand for them. So things had changed. So the village was changed. Remember the RIC barracks is built or is burned down. We're at the quest for getting independence. So when the Garda Síochána came into being, the Garda building, the barracks in the village was also built. Because what, 1920s? For a while, like first stages of independence, the Garda barracks, the original Garda Síochána barracks, moved around the village. I spent a while up in the Archdeacons, I spent a while below in the building next to the courthouse, but they needed their own building. So that was a residential. The sergeant was billeted in this side of the building, and the barracks was in the upper part of the building. Ash's shop, black pulling shop, can trace this back 100 odd years as a butcher and a general grocer in the village. So as we go up, like these buildings are become newer and newer. Like there was very little buildings, 100 odd, you know, the turn of the century, 1900, there was very little buildings up on this side of the village. So these date from there on. In Ash's house, this house, the red house behind us, was a village guest house and tea rooms. And the interesting thing about this house it's a stone-built house, and every stone in this house, Frankine, the Ashes and O'Donnell's, it was originally built by O'Donnell's. They came from Drumavalla, and every stone was quarried above in Drumavalla and came to the village by a horse and car. So it's a stone house, and it's fronted. It was plastered, and the block work was cut out of it. But it was a substantial house for its time. The house across the road was Kennedy's. It was known as the House of the Priests. I don't know, was there 4 of them, priests and a nun, in that house?
Oh yeah, the convent is called. My grandfather.
And that was where the rest of the houses were missing in this Indian village. That house was always there. That house was there. You know, there was no houses, we'll say, in the spaces in between, but the Moriarty's or it was Kennedy's house at the time. That was there. Your ancestors here. So this was another one of the tailors. This was Ferreters, and Ferreters. The building above. There was one of 3 or 4 tailors and 3 or 4 dressmakers, and you had Splans and Edmund Queen. You had a couple of cobblers. So you would, 100 odd years ago, it was well served. You could. It's hard to imagine where the trade would be for that supply of suit or clothing in the locality. But right, and behind us, where we saw the original part of the railway was up in the presbytery, up in the field. The railway ran behind the village, up these houses, and it emerged. See where that fence is? The railway ran up there and emerged at the front of the O'Shea's or Moriarty's hotel. And it went over parallel on the street over the main road. So, like, here's the original, he envisaged the rail station being here, somewhere. Not where it was, so that was his purpose of buying the site below where Brendan's pub is from Feile. We thought he'd be 50 yards from the railway station. So he misjudged. Yeah. After asking Mary Ward all about this, and I forgot about the water pumps until I see this one.
The water leak, I think.
Yeah.
My grandmother was a dressmaker job.
You're going to tell me the cost of the house?
100 quid.
£100. Right.
100.
Wait, what year?
What year was it now? I can't tell you what year. I have to think back.
And they were the original, like labourers' cottages, the railway workers.
I don't know, but he built
Not
the
how
house.
they began that. The Curtins and O'Briens. Isn't that what originally were the...
I don't know, but he built the house. My grandfather built that house with help, whatever.
But there was a house. Very good medical doctors in Annascaul. And this pump reminds me, there was a doctor in the 20s, the early part of the 20th century, called Dr. Kane. And Dr. Kane campaigned, he realised the significance of proper water, of a proper water scheme in the village. So Dr. Kane campaigned for water. So there were 4 water pumps put in by the council into the village in the 20s. So this was one. The one below John Brosnan's corner, there's one on the top of this road, and then there's one at the bottom of Annagap. Prior to that, the water supply in the village come from a few wells, one on the back road, one at the lower end of the village. But Dr. Kane was very instrumental in the provision of proper water facilities. These houses, right? So this was Morate's grandfather built this house. This house cost £100 to build in.
I suppose it's 100.
100 odd years ago. But the original site of these couple of houses up in the top end of the village, the Curtins, and next door to it was O'Brien's. They came to Annascaul as general labourers in the railway. So when the railway was built in the 1890s, they were the labourers maintaining and laying the line for the railway. So that's what brought Morate's great grandfather probably at the time to Annascaul. So, right, across the road from us, that was the Moriarty's Hotel or O'Shea's Hotel. It was always a fine building in the village. It belonged to the landlord of the area. It was connected with the Hicksons and the O'Shea's, where they had the land rents for the upper part of the village. And it's always played an important part in the village history and village life. Right, interesting, behind us the church. The church was built in as I said to you, Annascaul didn't even have a parish. The parish came in the 40s. It had 2 churches. It had a church in Ballinmore, dates from the 13th century. The church in Ballinmore collapsed. The church in Ballinacurty had partially collapsed and was taken down in the early 1800s. So for 50 years, Annascaul parish didn't have a church. And then they had a mad notion. Because it's still not a civil parish. They started building 2 churches in the village. There was a church here and there was a church at the bottom end of the village. One for Ballinmore parish, which was this one, and one for the Ballinacurty side of the parish, which was one below. Right, the bishop in Killarney got wind of he was told of the village building 2 churches. So the church here was in a more advanced state, so he decreed that this church become the village church. And the church below, which was in the back road, it was in Pat Fritz's field, it barely started. But that was taken down, and the stone and that was used to build the ball alley down at the bottom end of the village. So this church, Father Carroll, it dates from the 1830s, and the land was donated by Hickson, the landlord across the road. So, and the civil union of the Annascaul parishes we know today happened in the 1840s. So Camp, Loch, and Annascaul became a union of parishes around then, and had a parish priest and had an organised structure and record. So we no longer had the infighting of different parishes or different churches. All right, we're nearly there. Only two more.
That seems really
This building was the village casino. Remember the village casino? It was upstairs, the gambling and the darts that had a bit of money would be play cards and play, get up to devilment and wait. It was not a licensed premises, but it had I think a colourful period. So second last stop was the Palace Ballroom. So for those of you not familiar with Ireland, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, the big pastime in Ireland on a Sunday night or a Friday night or whatever was the village dance hall. So this was Annascaul's village dance hall. This was the Palace Ballroom. And this was built by two brothers, the McCarthy brothers, but it had, it was a busy ballroom, and it served the entire peninsula, from Castlemaine, Castle Gregory, back to Dingle and beyond. They would say the payment, I don't know what it cost but, to go into the ballroom, but I often hear that Mike McKenna would go. He was the security. He would go down to Eugene McCarthy's house with two buckets, aluminium or tin buckets of money. The money was paid into the So the last, I suppose, the dances stopped 60s. And the storm, there was the night of the bad storm, wasn't it? The gable, they were sheltered on the side of the gable of the dance hall that flew down. And they were lucky that there wasn't injuries or...
Travelling play groups used to come here as well, and they'd put on plays in the
remember one,
real central.
Yeah, it was a central part of village life.
The Feile walk there every in November, kind of 2 weeks before Christmas, and the youth club was kind of regular wintertime Friday. Yeah. And Tommy's mother had the house just above the dance hall, and Bridgie Barton supplied the mutton pies the nights of. She had a shop, she had a village, she had a shop, but she was also well known for her feeding the dancers, or feeding the. And we'd stop with last port call is the school.
When was that built, John?
The new one, 1914.
1914.
Yeah.
Well, my grandfather came from, because he had worked on the school, so sometime after that, the house.
So this is the village, still is the village school, it was the village school. Star we're going to all the, and it celebrates its centenary 5 or 6 years ago now. But it had been a school before that. But it's interesting in the building of the new school, we call this the newer school. That most supplies to the school came by railway. So there was a brown grey horse spent a couple of years up and down from the railway to this with the supplies for the school. It was built by Kennedy, isn't it? Where's the contractors to the school? But at the time that the school, the slate had to come for the school, this railway the railway passed up right here outside the school. So the railway carriage, or the rail with the slate stopped outside the school, and there was a chain of the kids bought the slate across the steps. Yeah. So it's still the village school, and in the last couple of days, Clara's village school teacher, but the last few days we're delighted to welcome 5 or 6 Ukrainians to the school.
From the hospital,
Yeah. So we hope their stay in Annascaul is rewarding and happy. Yeah. And behind us
is the sports field. And Annascaul, mind you, as we get into established Annascaul team, as we now know, established probably in the early 50s.
I have a picture of an Annascaul team from 1929 in with some lads and Keel as well.
Yeah.
Then as we said, it was
Yeah,
established.
it was there and not there, yeah, for the proceeding. But they will say that the modern day Annascaul J be probably the early 50s, and the field itself from the late 60s.
Yeah, this field, of course, the previous field back in Bealtaine before that.
Yeah.
And I think that originally looked like Mikey Hogan's field, not that
So, delighted that you came, and I hope you enjoyed your trip through our village. So, with God's help, the next time we do this,